So this is a totally different exercise paradigm to evaluate. What we saw was that when comparing this low glycogenic environment of a low carb diet versus high glycogenic or a glycogen environment of high carb diet over 6 weeks, if you adhered to the diet, that there was no difference in performance in these highly trained competitive triathletes. That at least at first glance illustrates that maybe this prevailing theory needs to be reevaluated, that high carb diets are the prevailing or necessity for high-end performance on both types of exercise spectrums.
Dude, Dr. Andrew Koutnik, there is some stuff coming out on carbohydrates, working out, performance that is absolutely going to rock the world. I mean, it's going to flip people on their heads, and people are going to lose their minds when we start like really understanding what's going on with carbohydrates and exercise. Like, dude, go for it. Tell me what's going on here.
So for a long time, Tom, people have always thought and or believed that high carbohydrate diets predominate in performance. And there's a lot of evidence that would suggest that's true. However, what we did is we took highly trained athletes, very high VO2 maxes, were running over 50 kilometers per week, very fit, lean body mass, and just this epitome of high athletes, high performers. We gave them low carbohydrate diets and a high carbohydrate diet, controlled so many variables. At the end of the study, what we found is that doing a very glycolytic dependent anaerobic exercise bout, a 1 mile time trial, and also a 6 by 800 meter sprints, what we saw is that these athletes performed exactly the same on a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet versus a high carb diet. Now, why might that be? Because all this evidence before has suggested that high carbohydrate diets are superior and that glucose is such an essential fuel for performance. Well, let's back up for a second. A lot of the evidence that has looked at performance in different domains has often looked at and shown a decrement to these ketogenic diets, has often looked at these diets in less than 4 weeks in duration. Now, there's multiple lines of evidence that illustrate that 4 weeks may be important for achieving certain metrics of metabolic homeostasis post-diet initiation. Anyone who's maybe heard of a ketogenic diet can appreciate that you have these changes in mineral load. You may lose very quick water weight. All these metabolic changes are happening very, very quickly. So what are those changes? When someone initiates a ketogenic diet, the first thing that happens, they're consuming less carbohydrates. We know that within the first meal, you lower the total glucose load and then start to lower total insulin secretion. Within the first 24 hours, you start to see increases in ketone bodies and fat oxidation, and also changes in subtle changes in things like respiratory quotient, which is this global body assessment of fuel substrate change. We know that things like glucose come down in a fast within about 7 days and kind of plateau there. But that's a fast. In this context, we see that things like the fuel use changes within maybe a 2 to 3 week period. It's pretty quick. Insulin's quick. Total glucose exposure, it's instant, right? So a lot of these changes that people have focused on and thought, well, these changes happen so quickly. You only need to do this diet for 7 to 12 days, 7 to 14 days, maybe most 21 days to really test the difference. Not so fast, okay? There's a lot of signs that show that even when you go on a full-fledged fast, such a powerful stimulus, that things like ketone production don't begin to show signs of normalization until at least 3 weeks. Well, what if you're doing something like ketogenic diet where the stimulus is not as potent, it's not as much of a lever you're pulling, it may take longer than that, okay? And so there's all these signs that maybe we're not achieving metabolic homeostasis as so many people have thought initially earlier on. And so all these studies that have looked at less than 4 weeks, maybe they're in an adaptation period. And if you're causing a stress such as an adaptation on top of trying to perform, that's 2 stressors on this side of the arm, on the ketogenic diet arm, versus someone who's probably already doing a high carb diet and didn't do any change. So what do you think is going to perform worse? Well, it's not surprising that within the studies that have shown less than 4 weeks in duration, not all, but many of these studies have shown a performance decrement to very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets. And we also know those diets can lower glycogen content. That has been shown in a number of studies.
So after today's video, our sponsor is Seed. I put a link down below for 25% off their daily synbiotic. So it's a probiotic and a prebiotic in one. So it has a really unique delivery system. So I am a fan of probiotics when you're making a change to like your diet or a lifestyle, because it can kind of help remodel that gut microbiome to help you make that shift a little bit sooner. Now, full disclaimer, they're a sponsor on this channel. That's how this channel works. It's how we're able to create amazing content. But my promise is that I only recommend products that I personally have used or currently use. So Seed down below, that is a 25% off discount link, again, for their daily synbiotic. I would probably guess that you'd notice a difference within about a week of taking it. Start noticing it digestively, you might start noticing it in other ways, but for me, I got more energy, I started sleeping better, things just seemed more regulated. So anyhow, that link down below, 25% off.
So how is it that we gave a very low carbohydrate diet, we controlled the calories throughout the entire study across both diets, we controlled the activity of these athletes, so they kept their activity consistent and were consistent across both diets. So same volume of activity. We also controlled their body composition. Okay, so we had all these controls that we know change metabolism, also change and cause their own form of stress and change overall physiology. So we controlled all of that. The only thing that changed was the macronutrient composition of the diet. But we gave them 4 weeks on the diet. Controlled it, registered dietitian was overseeing this. We confirmed ketone body elevation for compliance. All these things were controlled. And what we saw is they performed a 1 mile time trial to max effort. So if anyone's run a mile as fast as they can, that's not an easy effort. This is a very intense effort. And these are athletes who are runners. So like they were really going after it. We also did 6 by 800 meter sprints. So these was like hardcore, really high effort. What we showed is that these athletes in these anaerobic environments, very glycogen dependent, very carbohydrate dependent, carb oxidative dependent, performed exactly the same on a ketogenic diet as they did on a high carb diet. Well, why would that be? You know, everything that would suggest that you would need carbs to perform better in these anaerobic exercise bouts. This led us to have some follow-on work. But before I described it, there was other key details in the study that were very important. We tracked the glycemic control of these athletes who were in middle age. The reason that's so important is because you have these categories of individual that you can put into like metabolic health buckets on a big picture scale globally, or a big picture general population level. Young, healthy individuals who seem to largely be immune to most metabolic disease and dysfunction, although not completely nowadays, but historically speaking. Middle age, where you're in this in-between period before you reach aging, 65 years of age or higher, where individuals are at much reliably higher risk for many metabolic related diseases, diabetes, the list, I could go on a list of this, but either way, we looked at this in-between period because we know that individuals, there are changes that are occurring in this middle age window that are putting people at risk later on. They may be subtle and they may be seen, but we're very interested to look at that because the theory is like, if you exercise all the time, you would be completely healthy. But what we found is that actually 30% of these athletes who were fit, very low body fat, running over 50 kilometers per week, 30% of them had signs of continuous glucose monitoring. So we tracked these individuals over the 31 days on the diet using not just one single finger stick of their blood glucose, like a fasting glucose value or a single time point. We tracked them 24/7 for 31 days. And what it showed is that their glycemic values on a CGM, which tracks very well with other metrics that are diagnostic for diabetes, with values that were in line with pre-diabetes, okay, including fasting values. And 30% of them. That 30% also happened to be the hyper responders to the diet. So they had the greatest drop in blood glucose. In this study, we also showed the highest rates of fat oxidation ever reported at very high intensities. So historically speaking, if you were to take this, or say the audience this, and you say that this line up here is carb oxidation and this line right here is fat oxidation, or let's flip it actually, for very low intensity. So this is an intensity curve, okay? And for very low intensities over here, let's say you're sitting down, or then you go into a walk, or then you go into a brisk walk, into a slow run, then all the way to like a max out sprint. That's this bottom line down here, right? So from low intensity to very, very high intensity. And you look at the amount of fat and carb oxidized during these intense exercise bout, we see that fat's very high as a predominant fuel during very low intensity, and carbs are very low. And it actually, historically speaking, and that as you get closer to around the 60 to 70% of your VO2 max, it crosses over. It's called the crossover point, where the amount of fat and carbs consumed flips, because now you're in this very glycogenic, high intensity, energy dependent exercise or stimulus, which is exercise. And so you need more carbs because it's more anaerobic. And that has been the paradigm. What we showed is that even well beyond that 70% mark, be over 85% of someone's VO2 max, that fat oxidation was actually at record levels in people who had adapted for at least 4 weeks on a ketogenic diet. This was over 1.5 grams of fat being oxidized at a set rate, which is extremely high, and like record levels that had not been reported before. And what was amazing about this is this illustrated that individuals who adhere and adapt to a ketogenic diet for long enough on the diet while controlling their activity, calories, body composition throughout it. So they're not trying to caloric restrict. They're not trying to increase their activity load. They're just using the diet switch as their stimulus. They can not only shift their substrate utilization needs to meet the demands of very high intensity levels of exercise, which have historically only been thought to be utilizing carbohydrates, which that study obviously shows that's not the case. But it also shows that you can have equivalent levels of performance in these very historically glycogen dependent, high carb oxidative forms of exercise that are very high intense. So that really flipped us on our head, and I think a lot of other people on our head, that maybe there's something here, and that maybe the way we thought about carbohydrates in the diet being obligate for optimal performance may not be true, which then led to a theory. Okay, if you do these low carbohydrate diets and you have lower glycogen content in the diet, maybe glycogen's not obligate. Maybe there's something else that's important to dictate performance in these settings against low and high carb. So then we initiated a follow-on study, and a lot of this work was done with Philip Primps at Grove City College. Tim Noakes, who's a world-renowned exercise physiologist, published record numbers of paper and had some major discoveries in the field of ex-phys. And what this follow-on study wanted to look at is, okay, maybe there's something outside of glycogen or that is going on here. Maybe the prevailing paradigm was that high carb diets are superior, right? That's number one. But number two is also that carb supplementation during exercise improves performance and delays early onset of fatigue, especially in these long duration exercise bouts. Well, we wanted to test that and challenge that theory. So the first thing we did is we took healthy athletes. These are triathletes. So I don't want to belittle them. These are highly competitive athletes, triathletes who are getting close to 200 kilometers per week in cycle distance, okay? Fit, very high VO2 maxes. Again, this is a highly competitive, highly trained athlete. So not, some sedentary person off the street. And what we found is that when we put these individuals, again, on this diet, but this time we put them on the diet for at least 6 weeks, okay? Again, doing everything we can. We controlled calories, we controlled activity in this, again, big stimuluses that are important to control to really isolate out macronutrient effects. What we saw is when we used a low carb diet, which historically with lower glycogen content versus a high carb diet, we're really comparing here a different model. Is glycogen potentially obligate? And what we found is that we actually looked at very prolonged aerobic exercise. We actually asked people, these cyclists, to hit the wall. so to speak. This idea that we wanted them to go all the way into the point where they volitionally fatigued. So we tested their VO2 max, put them at 70% of their VO2 max, so a serious effort. And we asked them to go as long as they could until they hit the wall. Now, the wall has often been ascribed back to the 1921 in JAMA to be associated with hypoglycemia, okay? There was a paper that showed that when people hit the wall, so to speak, anyone exercise phys may have felt this when they did a long duration endurance exercise, about like a marathon, that they may start developing signs of what is called exercise-induced hypoglycemia. And this was originally shown back in the 1920s in a Journal of American Medical Association, very prominent journal at the time. And then showed that it was glucose levels that were low, and that the patients who were doing these marathons actually had signs of hypoglycemia, well-established signs of hypoglycemia, shaking, irritability, paleness, and that if they gave carbs in the form of food, they didn't have this response. So originally there was this thinking that, okay, if we mitigate hypoglycemia using carbohydrates, that may prolong exercise in this long duration exercise bout. So the first thing we tested, of course, was just the comparison of this prevailing dogma that not just doing, the study I referred to before was highly glycogenic anaerobic exercise where we saw no difference between a ketogenic diet and a high carb diet. Now we're switching the paradigm. We're looking at very prolonged endurance exercise at decently high intensities till people hit the wall, until they couldn't go any further volitionally, and they fatigued out on objective metrics of not able to maintain the power output, or they gave out. So this is a totally different exercise paradigm to evaluate. What we saw was that when comparing this low glycogenic environment of a low carb diet versus high glycogenic or a glycogen environment of high carb diet over 6 weeks, if you adhered to the diet, that there was no difference in performance in these highly trained competitive triathletes. That at least at first glance illustrates that maybe this prevailing theory needs to be reevaluated, that high carb diets are the prevailing or necessity for high-end performance on both types of exercise spectrums. Now, the second thing to that was that we wanted to evaluate if you gave carb supplementation. Again, we talked about this idea of exercise-induced hypoglycemia. Well, to my knowledge, very few or no one has really looked at this in the context of a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, because there's this idea that you can kind of go on forever on a ketogenic diet and you won't bonk. At least some people say that. Whereas the other theory is that, well, if you're in a low glycogen environment and you're also taking no carbohydrates, and we know that these diets can lower blood sugar, wouldn't it put you at more risk for hypoglycemia? In theory, it would actually put you at higher risk. And so we then said, okay, we want to provide carb supplementation, not just on a high carb diet, which is the prevailing performance optimization protocol. You do high carb diets and you give a certain amount of carbohydrates at set intervals, usually about 20-minute intervals, and you're usually shooting for anywhere between 60 grams per hour, so that's 20 grams every 20 minutes, or up to now in some recommendations, up to 120 grams per hour, okay? So a ridiculous amount of carbohydrates that are consumed. What we did instead is we actually provided only enough carbohydrates, 6 to 12 times lower than those optimization carbohydrate protocols, with the thinking that we're only going to give enough carbohydrate to mitigate exercise-induced hypoglycemia. We're isolating out the glycemic effect by doing the diet and actually prolonged fast of up to 15 hours before exercise. And then we're going to give carb supplementation across diet. What we saw is not only did people perform exactly the same on a low carb versus high carb diet over 6 weeks of adaptation to hitting the wall of prolonged exercise, kind of rethinking this whole paradigm of high carb diet versus superior for prolonged exercise, but then we gave carb supplementation on both approaches only up to 3.4 grams approximately, because weight-based, every 20 minutes for these athletes. So very, very minimal levels. Not only one, was it able to mitigate exercise-induced hypoglycemia. So exercise-induced hypoglycemia happened in almost the majority of both diet groups, okay? It completely eliminated that across both diet groups and led to a 22% performance increase in prolonged exercise in these athletes, illustrating that irrespective of diet, high or low carb, that you saw performance improvement, but both improved similarly. illustrating that it doesn't matter the diet you're on, that carb supplementation may be important, but it may not be as much as you think you need. Okay, some of the prevailing thinking is that you need 60 to 120 grams per hour. At the very least, this questions whether that may be necessary. And it certainly requires future evaluation, because we're only giving 3.4 grams, 3.4 to 3.6 grams every 20 minutes, which is 6 to 12 times lower than is recommended. We also put continuous glucose monitors on these athletes as well over the 6-week period. No surprise here, we saw this improvement in mean glucose, so reduced mean glucose, reduced standard deviation, and this happened over the duration of the 6 weeks. But then when we dissected out the week by week glycemic impact, we actually saw that over the whole diet, glycemic control was improved if you consider lower mean glucose and lower standard deviation improvement. But at the 4-week mark, after 4 weeks, we saw that glycemic control, when looking at 24-hour glycemic control, normalized on the low carb diet in these normal glycemic athletes. What that seems to suggest is that 4-week time period is in complete alignment with the prevailing theory that 4 weeks may be important for an adaptation period on a low carb diet in order to have equivalent levels of performance to high carb diet. So this adaptation time period. But what we also saw is that ketone levels reached a peak level at the 4-week time point and then maintain that peak level. So reach a peak and maintenance, which aligned perfectly with this normalization in glycemia. So this isn't to be confused with someone who has diabetes, goes on a low carb diet, and then sees this reduction in glucose that is maintained. These are in normal glycemic athletes who don't have any signs of prediabetes, because we actually looked at that. And they had a lowering of glucose. In theory, that might actually put them at risk for early exercise-induced hyperglycemia, but that went away after 4 weeks. So maybe there's something to some metabolic signatures of adaptation that we were observing here that may be related to glycemic control, which aligns with the ketone level peak and also maintenance, which also aligns with prior literature. So this is a very, very interesting study, which ultimately leads us to some key conclusions. One, it seems to suggest that when we did a study to actually look at low glycogen environments versus high glycogen environments, there's no difference in performance. So it at least alludes to this idea that glycogen may not be obligate for performance. And this was in prolonged strenuous endurance exercise for people to hit the wall. The second thing it also seems to illustrate is that carbohydrate supplementation on the back of a low glycogen environment seemed to be sufficient to improve performance substantially, 22% on both dietary paradigms, and completely eliminated exercise-induced hyperglycemia, which was observed without carbohydrate supplementation. So that seems to suggest that that is a key determinant of performance in this study, which was designed to isolate out that impact, okay? So it seems like glycemic control and exercise-induced hypoglycemia is a performance determinant. And again, this goes all the way back to that 1921 paper that shows that if you give carb supplementation, that it's important. But the levels of performance improvement we were seeing, although we can't draw a direct line of overlap to these other studies, if you look at some of the meta-analysis looking at 30 grams to 80 grams of carbohydrates with exercise, the amount of performance improvements are largely analogous to what we were seeing. So this opens a can of worms. Do we need 120 grams per hour? Maybe these elite athletes, maybe there's something, maybe they truly do. But let's back up for a second. 99% of people are not elite athletes, okay? Anyone who is the normal person out there, even myself, and Tom, you work out all the time, I work out all the time. You may be pretty close to that elite category. But what I'm talking about here is like someone who dedicates their entire life to performance and they are in the top 0.1% of their endeavor. They're biologically and phenotypically different, okay? What we're talking about is the rest of the 99%. What happens to the rest of the 99% of the world in these studies? And we were even looking at the high end of that, these highly competitive athletes. And we're not seeing this prevailing dogma that high carbohydrate diets are obligate for performance optimization. In fact, if you habituate to a diet long enough, what this is largely telling us is that you have options. Maybe you don't need to do a high carb diet if it doesn't fit for you. Maybe if you're someone who's struggling with prediabetes, maybe the health considerations of a dietary approach, like a low carb diet to lower glucose control, should predominate, because this idea that you need to pound carbohydrates and then supplement all the time during your marathon that you're running isn't necessary. It opens up choice for the athlete to make decisions, not just about performance, but also about health.
Dude, so it makes so much sense that the decline in performance would be more of an issue with going hypoglycemic than being low on glycogen. It makes so much more sense that is the case, right? That is a, I know I overuse this term, but it seems like that is just a bigger lever that would make you feel something much more so than glycogen. Just logically, it just seems like we have so many systems and processes to protect us, like when that happens. And when if glucose gets low, then yes, that's an alarm. That's an alarm, right? So, but it's happening at such like a high performance scale that you might not think of it as like a metabolic alarm saying emergency in your body. You're just registering it as performance decline because that's the lens in which you're looking at the world.
Yep.
So performance decline, when in reality, it's just metabolic alarm sounding, but it's manifesting in performance decline. But that's the lens that you choose to view it in because that's what you're concerned with at that time. Rightfully so. You're an athlete. And it makes sense because like what the amount of blood or sugar that we actually have circulating through our blood at any point in time is so much smaller than people think, right?
Yep.
I've almost always called on the fact that like, what good, and okay, full disclaimer, I eat carbs. I'm not afraid of carbs. I don't mind carbs. I don't say I particularly like them, but I don't mind them, right? It's never made sense to me that having a bowl of oatmeal before going into a workout would do anything for you. It has never made sense to me because I'm just like, how much do you actually need to elevate your blood sugar, and how much is that going to change your and that's not going to get absorbed into glycogen anyway. In that, like, it's not going to be synthesized into glycogen in a short amount of time anyway. So I've always kind of I'm like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't add up to me anyway. And there's some evidence to back that up. And now I'm like, I see this. Like, it makes sense. All we're trying to do is just stop the hypoglycemia. So what is the bare minimum that you can get across? And then it's probably opening up Pandora's box of all kinds of positive things. Now you're eliminating GI stress, in these endurance athletes. I mean, that's the biggest issue that I have if I'm doing an ultra or something like that, is like, how do I get fuel in? Yeah. But my philosophy, even when doing an ultra, has always been, not even with glucose, everything, what is the bare minimum amount of fuel that I need to get on board? I don't want to digest. Like, I want to just keep myself alive.
Yeah.
And that's just earth shattering, man. I mean, it makes so much sense though.
And I also want to state, I think it's important to caveat this by saying, there are studies that have looked at 60 versus 90 versus 120 grams per hour. And they show that there's some indications that as you go higher and higher and higher, there's a better performance output in those studies. What we were specifically trying to do here in this design was eliminate glycogen in a key contributor. In fact, actually have a comparison between low and high carb, specifically utilizing a diet approach to lower glycogen content, along with a 15-hour fast before the exercise, which would further lower that. These are both reliable strategies in the literature to do that. And then we were trying to isolate that across diet and then also give carbohydrates on top of that. And it really allowed us to answer a key question, which is exercise-induced hypoglycemia is a known determinant, is a determinant of performance, and that we maybe should reconsider how important glycogen, not that it's not important. There is some evidence that suggests that glycogen is an important determinant of performance. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that we isolated out that as a key variable and showed that if you compare these across diets, that you're allowing yourself to see some isolation. Now, some people might criticize it and say, well, that was a low carb diet and you're fully subsidizing that lower glycogen with fat oxidation. But that would then require people to acknowledge that fat oxidation is a key determinant of performance, both in our original study at very high intensity levels and also in prolonged exercise. Mm-hmm. So, which this is less controversial, but the former is definitely controversial. So there's a lot of reconsideration that I think this literature on these unique diets, these very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, has opened our eyes to reevaluation of some of our understanding of the crossover point. And is that in fact the true crossover point, because even some evidence in high carb diets don't actually match up with that range, that crossover point.
When I was doing the VO2 max test with Andy Galpin, he was like, dude, he almost went so far as saying like, you are carbohydrate intolerant. Like he was like, because like my fat oxidation rate was happening at such a high intensity, he was pretty blown away. He was kind of like, I almost wanted him to just do a muscle biopsy. And I right then and there, I was curious what my glycogen was at, like point is that as someone that has, and further follow on stuff to probably uncover like how long do some of these adaptations last? Even, for example, I spent years, close to a decade on a ketogenic diet. Yeah. And I still fast regularly, although I'm not on a ketogenic diet. And I would imagine, I don't want to get too into the weeds, that I've preserved a lot of that adaptation by continually fasting and almost exclusively training, even ultra distance training in a fasted state. I've probably maintained some of that adaptation to the point where, like, when I take a VO2 max test, I'm not even surpassing a 1 RER until pretty much the test is done. And I'm going into oxygen, debt and recovery afterwards. Yeah. Then I'm surpassing that. And
was that test on, let me ask a question, was that test done while you were on a ketogenic diet or not on a ketogenic?
Fasted, about 18 hours fasted.
But were you on a ketogenic diet prior to that?
No.
Interesting. Okay.
Not. Yeah, I'd say about 100 grams of carbs a day.
So there's some interesting evidence by Flockhart and Larson's group actually looking at athletes who adapt via exercise. So like individuals who do these very long duration aerobic exercise bouts and are engaged in exercise on a regular basis, independent of dietary paradigm, that when they start flipping towards higher levels of fat oxidation, one that's very predictive and associative, well, at least on the high carb paradigm in athletes, if you have higher levels of fat oxidation during exercise, that's often associated with better performance. But he also showed, interestingly enough, that when you start increasing fat oxidation in these athletes, that they also had poor oral glucose tolerance test glycemic control. Mm-hmm. And so, again, this gets back to the conversation we had on a different point about physiologic insulin resistance. And there's different stimuluses to pull here. Nutrition is clearly one of the most powerful, and not the most powerful, in shifting carb to fat oxidation. And particularly on the extreme ends of saying really lowering carbohydrates, you can get fat oxidation levels that you wouldn't see in an exercise-based stimulus. But they're both facilitating similar things, and so it's a very interesting conversation. In your case, where you have been on a ketogenic diet for so long, there was some evidence, although your scenario is so unique, that when someone was on a long adapted ketogenic diet, that if they reintroduced carbohydrates, that they didn't necessarily break fat oxidation and ketogenesis. Now, if someone were to be doing a ketogenic diet for like 5, 6, 7 days and they did that, you might like totally obliterate that. But in your so that study did it in someone who's prolonged adherence to a ketogenic diet. And so that at least alludes to this idea of what you are potentially seeing, which is these remarkably high fat oxidation levels. Although, you have to be blind to see you're not fit, okay? And I also worked out with you earlier, so I know you're actually in shape, on an exercise level. And so maybe there's an exercise component to that that's also playing into this. In fact, there's no doubt both are playing into it. We know both are important to it, but the degree to which one predominates the other is an interesting question. But at least when we talked about fat and carb oxidation, that if you do something like ketogenic diet, that will lead to fat oxidation levels that I don't think many other stimuluses or any can actually match.
And I love that you had Tim involved in this. Like I was fortunate enough to have interview Tim. I mean, one of the few I couldn't get in person, but it was one of the few that I was like, I'll do a virtual interview with you. I've been a fan of his work for such a long time. And he talked about, even in that interview, heck, for the sake of it, we can even cut to a chunk of that interview because it's so interesting.
Yeah, I must take one proviso there to our discussions. Currently, I'm writing a paper which I've been working on for about a year, and it looks at all the studies of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise or before exercise, before or during. And there are a number of studies where you can't explain the carbohydrate effect. And the only effect you can use is that it's a central stimulant, that it's a drug. And I'm very certain that for example, a 1 hour time trial, no question, ingest carbohydrate during the race, you'll do better. I would never argue that. Metabolism doesn't change. No measurable difference. The way carbohydrates work is your experiment, you have to set up the experiment so the control group, their blood glucose drops during exercise, i.e. the placebo group. Then you'll always find an effect of carbohydrates. If their blood glucose doesn't fall, you won't find an effect. That's in a longer event. In a short event, you'll almost always find an effect of carbohydrate, but it's not metabolically, doesn't do anything. So what is it doing? It's acting in the brain. So I honestly think carbohydrate is a drug. And that's why Tour de France cyclists use it so much, because when you're cycling 6 hours a day, you often need a stimulant. And I think that's the key stimulant that they use. And that's why I've got, in a sense, as you've said, triathlete friends who are high fat diets, but they said sometimes in the triathlon, I need that carb to give me that lift, that stimulus. So I think that's where we've got wrong. Carbohydrate metabolic effect is to prevent your blood glucose falling. That's it. And that you can only do by taking carbs during exercise. So that's why you have to take a little bit of carbs during exercise. Otherwise, the main effect is on the brain. It makes you perform better because you get a lift. And that lift can be achieved by just often putting the sugar in the carbohydrate in the mouth as well.
Yeah, we've seen that in some interesting data. I've seen that, recently, like just swishing it around in the mouth and even spitting it out can have a similar effect. And that is, we're seeing that replicated. That wasn't just one or two studies. I've seen that a few times. And then, and even with, if I recall, I don't want to butcher this, but it was basically straight malted extract or something that wasn't even sweet, if I recall. So it wasn't even something that was sweet, where we could hypothesize that, yes, the taste of something sweet might kind of amp you up a little bit. But even in cases where there were carbohydrates that were not sweet, am I mistaken, or did I think that's what I saw.
No, that's right.
Yeah. Where he talks about basically just swishing carbohydrates in the mouth, like had an impact, right? And even like potentially malted dextrin that has no sweetness to it, right? Like just like a swishing it around and mouth rinse. And I know we're seeing more of that coming out. I know the military has done some stuff with that, where just it makes us wonder. Independent, above just avoiding hypoglycemia, how much of it is up there?
Well, so the best answer I can give to you is one of the most reliable performance enhancing tools anyone can ever have is a pretty solid placebo effect. Okay. So if you wanted to improve your performance, you better start believing that whatever you're doing works. That is the most reliable way to improve performance. Every study has pretty much reliably showed this, right? And so if you say, hey, how much of this is in your head? There's no doubt a huge component this is in people's heads. That will always be a factor. Isolating that, you almost have to, cut the brainstem and it's an impossible thing, right? And so that's why in a lot of studies, we try to control as much as we can. So in both these studies, we did volume, taste, sweetness matched based comparatives, right? So we can try to analogously control as much of this as we can. This is also why in these studies we try to we do everything we can to control calories, physical activity, when we can, body composition, and because those are such powerful stimulus, all to the point where you bring up the idea that you just swish your mouth with carbohydrates without actually consuming them, and it causes performance enhancing effect. So yeah, you do everything you can in science to really isolate out factors, and not always can you do that, but as much as you can. And actually in both these studies that we did, this was actually a crossover design. And so what that means is that we had the same athlete doing both diets. So it wasn't like we did parallel groups. We actually asked these individuals to, in the first study, engage in a 10-week journey with us, right? 4 weeks on one diet, crossover, 4 weeks on the other diet. And in this case, 6 weeks, and then switch over to the other diet. And so they're really on this for the long haul. But what that allows you to do, you're isolating out, you're eliminating the genetic factors, the environmental factors, except for food, obviously that was changed, but their house environment, their sleep environment, like all that is, you're able to control that when you do these crossover designs. So we did everything we could to really try to answer this question as well as we could, is what is the macronutrient specific effect in these different performance contexts. And it does appear that at least prevailing take home from both of these studies is that as long as you adhere to a diet long enough, you appear to have equivalent levels of performance. that one diet doesn't predominate over the other. So it gives you choice. And the other end of this, the other take home is that that we know that there are multiple key determinants of performance, but it appears that we were able to isolate out and really hone in on the idea that exercise-induced hypoglycemia, while we're not the first to ever demonstrate that matters. I mean, that was demonstrated in 1921 to matter. What we're illustrating is that in low glycogen environments and very minimal levels of carbohydrates, that this can have a meaningful performance impact by completely being in alignment with elimination of exercise-induced hypoglycemia. And so this does open a lot of questions. There will absolutely be people who view these studies differently and have different interpretations. And so I'm really excited to have everyone's feedback on this and really start taking that feedback and advancing our understanding of science even further.
And we'll link to the study too, because and just FYI, to get good eyeballs on a study helps get the study in front of more people, because there's algorithmically based too, even on PubMed. So I'll link out to the study so that everyone can check that out. It was interesting when I was talking with Andy Galpin a couple of months ago. He actually kind of acknowledged even what you're talking about before this study even come out, because he said, and I haven't clipped with it, basically he's like, there's not a whole lot of a difference in performance between low carb and high carb. He's like, what we did notice is like a lot of times when people would selectively go on a low carb, they would end up inadvertently reducing their calories. Mm-hmm. And he said, what we did notice was that there was a performance decline when their calories were lower.
Yeah.
And he's like, that's just kind of what inadvertently was happening. And so he's like, I pretty much convinced that like if your calories are high enough, like you're going to be fine. He's like, most people when they like get rid of an entire macronutrient, they don't realize they're also cutting the calories down too. And that's the one thing, again, I go back anecdotally, but like that's what I noticed too. Is like on a lower carb diet, my satiety is so high, I end up getting to the end of the day and being like I really didn't even eat that much. Yeah. Then I will see a performance decline. When I have carbohydrates, and as again, I reference all these people I've interviewed, but Dr. Mike Israetel, he said something that was so powerful. He's like, carbohydrates are great for inducing appetite. Are they good for building muscle? Maybe not necessarily directly. In fact, there is that ribosomal paper that just came out that just basically demonstrated that like it doesn't really do anything additional for muscle growth. But he was just like, they are a great appetite stimulant. So he's like, if you want to eat more and you want to put on more muscle, he's like, calories being fairly high on the hierarchy of building muscle. He's like, increase your carbohydrate content. I'm like, that is a logical way to put that, because when I eat carbohydrates, I tend to just, my calories overall are higher. Yeah. All that being said, I have a question. I know I keep bringing this stuff back to some of my anecdotal stuff, but I think I might be mistaken, but I think that's why people like this channel, is because I experiment on stuff myself and then I talk to the experts about it. I've done a lot of fairly extreme events, usually just self-inflicted, somewhat masochistic, weird things. For example, I don't even want to toot my own horn, so I'm not even going to go there, but long endurance events that are also extreme. They're not like zone 2. Like I'm talking like we're getting into zone 4, possibly even 5, major altitude changes. I don't feel good when I have carbohydrates when I do it, so I don't. I've attempted doing these things fasted, but I do reach a point where I'm like, okay, after 8,000 feet of vertical gain, like fasted's not working too well. I'll start to cramp or something. So I've experimented just being like, okay, have a chomp stick or an Epic bar or something, even like crazy lean protein, even chicken breast, brings me right back to earth, and I get performance improvement, and I'm right back. And that's with zero carbohydrate intake and very minimal, if any, fat intake. Is this in my head, or is there anything to reinforce this? I haven't seen a lot of like protein, intra-workout protein studies.
Well, so two things. One is, in knowing some of the types of climbs you've done and have shared before, these are extremely long duration, right? And you're also fasted versus having some calories. So the first thing people might say is, well, you're having calories. Okay, so that's helping you by giving you some caloric needs during the exercise bout. So that's the first thing most people are going to focus on, especially in the ex-phys community. That's why. But there's also something else. We talked about exercise-induced hypoglycemia. We did a study that seemed to demonstrate, as well as prior work, that's an important determinant of performance. And so we know that protein in of itself has its own glycemic response. It is obviously much lower, okay? But you can look at multiple data going back to Collier in 1981 and 1983, where they show these acute protein, carbohydrate, and responses to food. And protein does have a glycemic response. So it is possible that you might have been having early hypoglycemia while you're fasting on and/or low carb or high carb diet, doesn't really matter. at least our data says that it shouldn't matter, and that you had protein during that, and that should maybe help support, some elevations of glycemia. So maybe that's another factor that was playing a role here in you feeling better or having the energy or, attenuating the decline you were feeling. It's actually a well-known strategy in the context of type 1 diabetes to have a more normal and prolonged glycemic control, because carbohydrates had this potent and rapid impact on glycemia. In fact, the peak endogenous insulin response to carbohydrates, at least let's say you say 50 grams of potatoes, that's going to be at the 30-minute mark, the peak. Whereas protein, the peak's much lower, about 2.5-fold lower, and it also is prolonged, and it's lower, the peak happens later, and it stays higher for longer. So in theory, when you're doing something such long duration, and let's say that maybe exercise-induced hypoglycemia was a factor, protein may be a ideal strategy in your case to maybe mitigate some of that, more so than just having a huge bolus of carbohydrates would. Although carbohydrates clearly would increase your blood sugar level, no doubt about that. But maybe in this case, this helped in some way with that.
Well, you being type 1 diabetic, maybe you can answer this. This is interesting. So I did one event. It's called Cactus to Clouds. It starts at the floor of Palm Springs. So you're starting at sea level and you're going up to 11,000 feet and you're knocking this out, and then down, and you're knocking this out in a day. So it's a lot of vertical gain. So 11,000 feet of vertical gain. No water on the trails. You're packing all your water. So you're carrying 30 pounds at least. I attempted to do it fasted. I was like, I want to do this whole thing fasted. Granted, I'm at that time about probably 5.5% body fat. So not a lot to pull from anyway. And I knew I'm just curious, got up to 8,000 feet and, intermediate started cramping. Body basically started shutting down, right? It's like, no, you're not doing this. I'm like, okay, I need to eat. So I hit the panic button and I had a bunch of jelly beans. Not only sick to my stomach, but chills like no other. I felt like I had the flu. I mean, I had goosebumps, like it was scary. So
interesting. Yeah.
I wasn't able to test my blood sugar, but I'm assuming that I don't know. Did I go sky high, or did I have some weird insulin response where I crashed even worse after that? But I mean, that was okay, Thomas, when you hit that was my lesson learning there, that like, no, next time protein this out because that just did not respond. So just out of curiosity, any idea what may have happened in that case? The chills and everything? That's
an interesting thing. I don't have an answer for the chills, although I actually think it's, to back up for a moment and actually speak about you started to cramp. That's an interesting point, because when I was talking about the 30-minute time point with carbohydrates and then proteins more prolonged, they both come with an insulin response too, although protein's clearly much lower. Again, this is around 2.5 times lower, only 40% of the actual total insulin requirements for a gram per gram match. And they're calorie matched because they're both 4 kcals per gram. And obviously when you have insulin, you're gonna shuttle in more water, right? So you might've been reaching a point, just pure speculation here, where we're becoming partially dehydrated and maybe having a little bit of insulin on board, because it sounded like you packed a decent amount of water, and having that simultaneously could help shuttle and compensate or attenuate, maybe is a better way of saying it, some of the what appear to be dehydration if you're facilitating cramps.
To a certain end, just to jump in there with that, and I'm very, very particular about electrolyte balancing and whatnot, and like knowing when I'm cramping and when potassium based versus sodium based, and like I'm pretty good at that. And it seemed to make no difference, which was what was interesting to me.
But what's interesting about that is look at Gatorade. Gatorade is one of the most well-established, best hydration tools there are. It's been around for forever, but it has a ton of carbohydrates in it. Mm-hmm. So a lot of how people hydrate and balance electrolytes is largely based on the theory that it's on the backdrop of a very glycemic, a lot of carbohydrates along with it, because that's also helping shuttle in some of the water as well. And so when you're in a context where you're having a huge deficit in carbohydrates, the rules, I suspect, are changing here, and how those minerals are going to be absorbed, because if you don't have insulin, you certainly would not bring in as much water, right, into these tissues. And so that absolutely would affect, osmolarity or mineral load. And we know that even with a ketogenic diet, one of the first things that happens when you lower carbohydrates within the diet is that it has this natriuretic response. You release a lot of sodium, you lose a lot of water weight. So I've actually experienced that a number of times myself, where if I wake up and I just have coffee and I ride it out for a long period of time, I don't have a whole lot of food, I can literally physically see myself becoming, I don't want to say dehydrated, is maybe not the term, but you can start seeing the signs of dehydration.
You and I are like, 7 hours into hanging out together. We've trained fasted. We both haven't consumed anything except for when you went hypoglycemic and you had some Smarties. Yeah. And I could noticeably see, when I went in the bathroom, I can noticeably see my face looks, your face looks leaner. Like, you drop the water as the day goes on. It's noticeable. It really is noticeable. Like, you just start the day and you just there is, and I've peed and have barely consumed much water today. So I'm like, something's happening.
And I can actually attest to this effect as well. And I'm sure you're the case when you go these very prolonged periods of fast. And it just, in my scenario, if I have any type of food, after that period of time, the visual change that occurs is so apparent. The vasculature, it's night and day. So there's clearly an impact. And I noticed that if I were to have food after a very prolonged period of fast, I have to wait, because the insulin kinetics in type 1 diabetes is much slower. And so what I find is that my timing might be different than someone else because of this. But if I have that food and I'm looking like 2 hours post, because a lot of the insulin response, it's full insulin response, even the fastest acting insulin type 1 takes about 2 hours to have its full effect. That after that point, if I'm working out without any food, let's say I didn't eat food before, and then all of a sudden I introduce any food, it could be just protein or carbs, any form of that I will sweat so much more afterwards. And I don't see that if I fast the whole period of time, I don't have the food, despite having the same amount of water. So I've always attributed this just speculatively. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying this paper showed this exact thing in the patient with type 1 diabetes. I'm not saying that here, but just my personal anecdotal experience is that I definitely hold more water weight. And of course, that can certainly translate to things like anaerobic performance. If the tissue is fuller and larger, even if it's just water, that can have a substantial difference in leverage of those muscles to produce force and other things. So either way, I actually have very similar experiences to you in this case. Yeah.
Yeah. It's and I will, I know we'll wrap up here, but I will say, and hopefully people will get some value out of this, I will never ever do a long endurance event without having taurine on board now.
Interesting.
Taurine it has saved my so many times. If I start to feel, I take it sort of prophylactically. Yeah. I mean, the time to exhaustion, data on it is strong anyway. 3 to 6 grams of taurine. Yeah. And I'll just pop 3 to 6 grams every 90 minutes or so during that. And it's no cramping, same kind of things the same. I can stay fasted. I don't totally know the mechanisms behind the cramping piece. Massive antioxidant effect. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the literature, basically when they cross-sectional area and biopsy, when they take athletes that are training to exhaustion, like endogenous taurine levels are very concentrated and high at the muscle level, meaning that there's something that's going on there, right? Yeah. So I've toyed around with it, and 3 to 6 grams. I mean, it's game changer, but who knows? Maybe it's in my head too. But it's just like, that is the one thing that's like, wow, okay, I won't do a long endurance event without it.
Interesting. I do know there's plenty of data on taurine, co-administered with things like caffeine that helps in the context of exercise performance, or actually cardiovascular measures. And so it's interesting to hear your experience. I've never taken taurine by itself.
Try it. Interesting. Who knows? I mean, it's going to work automatically because I said it worked, but it's pretty wild. So anyway, man, where can everyone find you?
They can find me. I stay pretty active on Twitter. I try to stay engaged and share things and communicate with the scientific community at Koutnik, so Koutnik on Twitter or X, however you want to refer to it. I have an Instagram, Andrew Koutnik, PhD, and I also have a website where I try to put out as much free information as I possibly can for people who are trying to understand metabolism. Maybe they have type 1 diabetes like I do and want to understand more of that journey at andrewkoutnik.com.
Right on, my man. Thanks, brother.